Yes, hello once again, welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV. Now, I've been having a little rake around my picture archives and I've come up with another bike that you may like to have a look at. Now, this particular machine here was actually a bike that I did a motocross article on for a certain off-road publication a way back in the day, and this was my very early attempt at amateur journalism. So we're going to take a look at that bike now. So let's dive straight into the video and take a look at Paul Toulouse's lovely 1982 250CR Husqvarna. Okay, so this featured 1982 250CR Twinshock Husqvarna is a nice bike taken from my dirt bike archives, and as I said, this was one of the very early machines that I covered when I was still supplying motorcycle articles for various off-road vintage dirt bike publications of their day. And although these were the days before I used video to profile these kind of bikes, these pictures of this bike will hopefully still be able to tell the same story, even although we don't have any video clips to complement this feature. So basically what we're looking at here is a 1982 250CR Husqvarna twin shocker, and this bike at the time of taking these pictures had just undergone a full rebuild by Scottish motorcycle enthusiast Paul Toulouse from Stenton near Edinburgh. But the story of this particular bike all begins when Paul had seen an advertisement on an internet auction site advertising a complete 1982 250 Husqvarna, which unfortunately wasn't actually assembled, but it was dismantled and in a selection of various plastic boxes. So it was pretty fair to say that Paul was still interested in purchasing all of the Husky parts, because his late father did have a similar machine that he used to race at local scramble events in Scotland, and Paul's thinking was that if he could buy the dismantled Husky at the right price, then he'd like to do a full restoration on the bike and maybe bring back some memories of those good old days when he used to accompany his dad to race his old 82 bike at scrambles around their local area. So Paul was straight onto the phone to the seller, who told him that this bike had seized up on him during a race event, and he then just completely dismantled the entire machine and then placed all of the parts into boxes with the original idea of eventually rebuilding it at a later date. Although 20 years later the bike had still not been rebuilt, so the owner decided just to sell it on, and after a brief bit of the negotiation between Paul and the seller, he then handed over £950 for all of the boxes of Husky parts, and then he quickly loaded them up and headed home to Scotland. Now, when Paul returned home with all of the boxes of Husky parts, the good news was that on first inspection it appeared that most of the parts needed to put the Husky back together were all intact, but some of them needed quite a lot of remedial work to make a complete motorcycle again. And the other dilemma that Paul was really worried about was that he'd never tackled anything like this before, so this was to be his first ever venture into taking on a full rebuild project such as this. Now, initially Paul decided that probably the very best place to start was with the bike's chassis, and rather than farm this part out to be refurbished, he decided to do this part of the restoration on his own. So He first inspected the chassis for any damage, which surprisingly was in quite good condition considering its age, but it didn't require any repairs or welding, so Paul then set about sandblasting it clean and then repainting it in this Husqvarna silver colour. Now, before Paul got down to any further refurbishment of the bike's components, a sizable list of new old stock parts were then drawn up, and a quick call to HVA Factory in Newton Abbot in Devon, who received a list of brand new components that Paul required, and these would be sent to him as soon as HVA Factory had them in stock. Now, Paul told me that he's no stranger to chucking spanners around the workshop, although stripping and then rebuilding this Swedish Husqvarna engine was certainly going to be virgin territory for Paul, because he'd never tackled anything like this before, but nevertheless he still wanted everything done absolutely right, so he thought it best to just entrust this part of the build to somebody who knew what they were doing. So this 250 engine was then dropped off at classic dirt bike builder Rob Spry's workshop for Rob to do a full strip down and rebuild of the engine, and then return it to Paul so that he could slot it back into the refurbished chassis. Now, during Rob's strip down and rebuild of the engine, he said that it was surprisingly in quite good condition considering its age, although he did notice that a few of the cooling fins on the motor's barrel did have some severe cracks, and generally the barrel wasn't really in the greatest of health. So rather than spend a lot of hours on repairing it, Rob decided just to source a replacement barrel, but after giving the bottom end of the engine a clean bill of health, Rob then rebored the replacement barrel and then fitted a new piston and rings, and then he gave the entire motor a very nice coat of hard wearing black stove enamel. And when Paul got the finished engine back from Rob, it wasn't too long before it was fitted back into the bike's chassis. Now, the Husqvarna's front legs, as you'd expect, were given a full strip down and rebuild, and brand new springs were also fitted inside, along with all the usual seals and new oil, etc. And the forks inner stanchions were also sent for re-chroming, even although these were in quite decent condition when they were first inspected. The fork bottoms again were also stripped back to bare alloy, and these were given a brand new coat of paint as well. Not so much to protect the outer casings from any damage, but it was just to make them look a little bit better when all the other parts of the front suspension were put back. And when that eventually all happened, the bike's front forks were almost as good as new once again. Now, also on the front end of the bike, the original alloy wheels that came with the boxes of Husky parts still looked like they were in decent condition. So the old tired spokes were then removed and brand new ones fitted, and the rims were also then polished before the newly refurbished hubs, new spokes and wheels were all put back together to look factory fresh once again. Now, it was much the same kind of process that took place on the Husky's rear wheel hub and rim, and when both the front and the rear wheels were all completed and suited and booted with a brand new pair of motocross tyres, then they certainly looked great and were good to go. Now, the original exhaust expansion chamber that came with the boxes of spare parts had, without doubt, been through the motocross wars, and it was full of dings and dents, and it looked like it had been repaired about 1,000 times and was basically just a piece of scrap metal and of no use at all on a refurbished motorcycle. So Paul decided just to secure a brand new old stock item to fit onto the 82 Husky, and as you can see, it certainly looks the part, bolted into its rightful place. Now, the old Husky tailpipe was in about as good condition as the original front pipe, so this was substituted for this much better and much lighter alloy part. But once again, the original Mikuni carburetor that came with all of the parts was cleaned and then simply reused on this bike. But the bike's air filter and cage had to be replaced because of their condition, and two new plastic side panels also had to be fitted, as the originals were faded and damaged. Now, the old shocks that came with the bike, as you'd expect, looked tired and worn out, although they did look like they were the right ITC piggyback units that were fitted onto this bike back in the day. So these were simply dismantled, revalved and then regassed, and their outer springs were powder coated to make them good enough to bolt back onto the bike. But these old ITCs, as you know, were really just Olin shocks under a different name. And once again, the 250 Husky's fuel tank was still in decent condition after being mothballed under a cover for the last 20 years, but it still had its battle scars and patina from its previous encounters on the racetrack. So this was given a thorough clean and then completely stripped of its old paint and given a complete refurbishment, including a new gas filler cap there on the top and a fuel tap on the bottom. And to finish its restoration, new Husqvarna graphics were also then added. Now, when it came to the bike's old original seat, when it was removed from all of the boxes of Husky parts, externally it was in a pretty dire state, although the good news was that the seat base and its foam insert were still good enough to be reused on the bike's rebuild. So a replacement seat cover was ordered, and then it was refitted to the original base and foam padding before this completed part was once again bolted back onto the chassis. And so, as the bike was nearing its completion, the old plastic front and rear mudguards that came with the boxes of parts were all next to useless and certainly not suitable to be reused on a new bike. And so Paul did price up a set of replacement new old stock Husky parts, which he thought were just far too expensive. So then he just opted to go for a set of Acerbis units instead, because these were at a more reasonable price, and he thought that these looked and fitted better onto the bike. But it was a UFO front number plate that finished off all of the plastic parts on the bike, and all of the bike's controls, including the Renthal handlebars, throttle gasser, cables, grips and clutch and front brake levers, were all brand new items, because Paul didn't want to chance his luck by reusing those old worn out parts on the brand new bike. But the entire project from strip down to this finished bike took Paul almost a full year to complete, which meant long hours in the workshop and lots of nights working into the small hours of the morning, which of course was all in between Paul holding down a full-time job as well. Although when you take into account all of the brand new parts that Paul added to this project, he's not only used as many of the bike's original parts as possible, but also added a substantial quantity of replacement parts as well. So even although this has been Paul's first project with regards renovating a motorcycle, you can see that he's certainly not scrimped when it came to buying the parts that he needed to make the bike right. And looking back at the quality of this final restoration and the fact that this was Paul's first ever venture into a motorcycle refurb or restoration, you certainly have to give him top marks for his hard work and the way that this bike has eventually turned out. Although you have to remember that this particular restoration really all came about because of Paul's memories with his dad when he raced a similar 82 Husqvarna to this one a way back in the day. And this wasn't just a case of bringing an old Twinshocker back to life. This was a personal challenge for Paul, just to see if he could actually pull it off, with this being his first time venture into dirt bike restoration. And I'm sure if Paul's father was still around and he saw the quality of Paul's workmanship, I'm pretty sure that he would be the very first person to say, "Well done." Well, I hope you enjoyed that walk around Paul's 1982 250CR Husqvarna, a bike that certainly brings back some nice memories for me, as that was one of my very early attempts at amateur journalism when I used to do features for off-road magazines. Now, coming up next here on CDB TV, we're going to take a look at another Italian stallion. So we're going to take a look at this nice SWM 370 Twinshocker. Now, this is another bike from the John Porteous Classic collection. We've already featured quite a few bikes of John's here on my channel, but this is another one of John's lovely machines. So we'll feature this 370 SWM when we return to Classic Dirt Bike TV. But until then, everybody out there, continue to be safe and well when you're riding those old vintage dirt bikes, and I hope to see you back here again very soon so we can talk about more of these old school dirt bikes right here on your #1 and favourite Classic Dirt Bike TV channel.